Hello and welcome. This is Lisa Jones, and you are listening to the Exploring Death podcast. Hello and welcome. It's Lisa Jones with the Exploring Death podcast. And today I have with me Paula Lenz. Paula was born and raised in Texas, and yes, she says y'all. She graduated with a BA degree from Sam Houston State University and retiring after 40 years as a business leader. And no, she's decided not to sit around in a rocking chair like a lot of people do. She decided to write her book, Driving into Infinity, Living with My Brother's Spirit, describing her life-changing experiences with her deceased brother, Don. And today we get the opportunity to chat with her about this extraordinary experience. And I know it's going to be an amazing, awesome podcast. So welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm very excited to be on your podcast show.
Oh, well, thanks for being on it. And I was reading through all the materials that you sent me and a little excerpts from your book. And truly, you have one of the more compelling and incredible stories that I've heard to date about not only was it a, out of body experience, but it was a shared death experience. And all of these, like you had the grand slam, right, of the whole experience. So why don't you start with, talking about where this all, began with you?
Okay, sure. Well, I start the story of how this all came about really in the fall of 1982. And that's when I began to have a recurring dream that came back to me for a year off and on. And this dream was always the same in that I was outdoors. There were some rolling hills, a tree or two here or there, and there were groups of people beginning to gather there. And eventually, more and more people came to be standing outside on these hills. And eventually, someone came up to me and asked me, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm not sure, but I've heard that it's the end of the world." And when I said those words, Jesus appeared in the sky up above us. And at the same time that happened, I just doubled over in pain, almost down to the ground. But this pain was not a physical pain. It was like sheer agony through my entire being and my heart. And then the dream would end abruptly, and I would wake up startled and just unsure why I kept having this dream, because I didn't know what it meant. There was no reference to my brother or anything like that. So I fast forward now to the fall of 1983, specifically Friday, October the 7th. And my husband and I lived in Houston at that time, and I was driving him that morning to a meeting. I was dropping him off. I was continuing on to downtown Houston to the Greek festival, and he and some other friends were going to be joining us later during the day. And as I was driving him to this meeting, all of a sudden I got this terrible pain over my heart area, a very deep, sharp pain. And I was quite frightened by this. I didn't say anything to my husband. I just kept driving, but I did glance at the clock in the car just to be sure we were going to be on time for his meeting, and it said 9 a.m. And as I continued to drive, the pain continued, and I said to myself, am I having a heart attack? Do I have a blood clot? I don't understand what's happening here. But after about 15 minutes, that pain subsided. And so eventually I just kind of blew it off and dropped him off. I went on down to the Greek festival. And you have to understand that the Greek festival in Houston is a very popular event. My friends and I, when we got there, in the morning, people were gathering there. And it is outdoors at the Greek Orthodox Church there. It's a huge campus area. but you go inside for lunch. And so eventually we did make our way around lunchtime inside the church, which is actually an annex area where they served the food. And as we were waiting in line, I glanced through the crowds by now, which were quite huge. And I saw my then husband coming toward me. And as he got closer to me, I saw his face, and I had never seen him look like that before. And I knew that something was terribly wrong. And when he saw me and came up to me, he put his hands on both my arms and he looked me right in the eyes and he said, "Donnie was killed in an accident this morning." And I just stood there looking at him, and in my mind's eye, what I saw was the earth, a picture of the earth as though I were standing out in space looking at the earth, and it just fell down, 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 and it just crashed like on a floor below it and shattered into a million pieces. And I just doubled over almost to the floor, crying and just saying, "No, no, no." And all my friends saw this and came rushing over, and it was a horrible moment for me. So then, of course, we traveled that evening to Bryan, my hometown there, about 90 miles north of Houston, and joined my family there. And of course, then we had the funeral, and I looked at people as though I was looking at them from a very long tube. It was all unreal. But one of the things that happened to me first was at my dad's house, as people were coming and going, I realized that it felt as though my brother was in the living room, but he was up in the right-hand corner area in the ceiling. And I just knew he was there looking down at me. And I just said to him, why? I just couldn't understand. So that was a little bit unusual experience there. But essentially, 3 days after his funeral, I stayed up in my hometown. I was actually driving his personal truck. My husband had left me there and gone back to Houston, but I was driving his personal truck, and I was taking some flowers out to my grandparents. They lived out in the country, which was about a 10 or 15-minute drive. And on the way, as I'm driving, I was by myself, I suddenly developed 360-degree vision. I could see everything around me. And I'm driving and I'm wondering what is happening to me. And then I realized that my brother was standing at my right shoulder area. And he was a pattern of lights, but you could see that it was him. And he began speaking to me telepathically. Now I'm still driving and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. But he said to me, "I don't want you to be sad. I want you to be happy because I'm happy." And he said, "I've come to show you a little bit of what it's like for me." And when that happened, I was no longer in the truck driving. I left with him. And he remained at my shoulder area, I'll say, for this entire experience and continued to speak to me telepathically. But at first I saw, it was almost like a landscape that looked like the negative of a photo or something, but that kind of went away. And then it felt like I was out in the universe, and I realized I was just consciousness. I was all consciousness. And when I realized that, I felt this entire complete oneness with everything. And the first wave, I'll call it, that I felt was this overwhelming peace. And what came to my mind during that was the peace that passeth understanding. And the second wave was all knowledge. And I knew that I knew everything that had ever happened in the history of the universe. And then the final wave of this was this energy, this powerful energy of love, all love. And, this was all part of spirit and the oneness of experiencing spirit and everything there is to experience in that state of consciousness. And I knew that I was home. That's the word that came to me. I was home. And I didn't care anything at all about returning to my body. I knew that I was out of my body and that somewhere I was still driving, but it just didn't matter to me. I didn't care. And I started thinking I wanted to go on. Now, remember, my brother is still with me right at my shoulder. And when I began to think like that about going on and remaining here, I felt as though I was whooshing away very rapidly. And when that began to happen, my brother said to me, "No, you can't go yet. It's not your time." And he, I'll say, exerted his energy on me and very rapidly pushed me. This is what it felt like to me, pushed me back down. And I could see myself coming back down into my body, back into the truck. And at that moment, when I landed, that's how it felt like. I landed with a thud back into my body. It's interesting, but the very first thought that I had was, wow, this is so constricting, like this body. It's just like, man, this is awful, I'm just so restricted in this body. And my face felt very warm. I continued driving, but actually I noticed and realized that I had actually made a turn onto the road that took me to my grandparents while I was out of body. And, to this day, I have no recollection of driving during that time period, however long that was. I don't know. I estimate it was maybe 4 or 5 minutes. But when I got to my grandparents, I just, I felt so at peace, and I just didn't have any of all these terrible feelings. And I knew my brother was happy and that everything was well and he was alive. But, I didn't say anything to my grandparents. And what was interesting about that was I could suddenly see from my brother's viewpoint how he was seeing all of us mourning him, because I could see how distraught, of course, and completely grief-stricken my grandparents were. And I wanted to say to them, it's okay, he's alive, it's all right. But I knew that wouldn't really help. And I could just see how it was for them, this different viewpoint. But after that, my consciousness and my view of humanity and life, everything changed after I had this experience. But it was a very, very long time before I ever mentioned anything about this experience. And when I finally did, it was only to like 2 or 3 of my very closest friends who I knew would understand. But even each one of them didn't know everything.
So I want to ask the question, why did you not share this? It seems like oh, this is something I'd want to tell everybody about, but I'm curious. And I'm asking this because this is so common, why people don't share, but I'm curious why you specifically didn't share.
I just didn't want people to think I was completely crazy or that I was, so depressed or whatever about my brother's passing that I was just delusional. And at that time in my life, this was 1983, I was 30 at the time. 35 years have gone by since then. At the time, I didn't really know anything about such experiences. And nor, had I ever actually talked to anyone who had had an experience like that. And I just felt like it was best not to say anything. As I said, eventually I did talk to a few of my closest friends, and they were very understanding and they believed me. But it just was not something that I discussed. And, thereafter, for the rest of my life, I've had outreach from my brother. Not that I've ever had another out-of-body experience with him. I have not. But not only did I have outreach from him in other ways, but I had a number of after effects, which are more common to near-death experiencers, which again, I didn't know anything about that.
Right. Yes, I know. Well, let's talk about that because I think that's another aspect of these out-of-body experiences, whether it's a shared death or a near death or just even, I don't know. There's so many different terminologies, but there are these after effects, and which I didn't realize until a year ago when I got involved with IANS and started talking to all these people, that when I had my shared death experience 15 years ago, that I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes sense now why I can't eat the same things I used to eat, or why I'm so sensitive to, lights or noise, or, so many things change, but I didn't put it together until once you start talking with others. So I'm curious what your after effects were.
Yeah, and you're exactly right about all those things. So I'm going to just address an aspect of that before I get into the effects. But one of the things that began happening to me almost immediately was that I felt absolutely compelled to read everything I could get my hands on about any and everything related to spirituality or other beliefs around the world. And that through that quest that even today I remain on. I mean, I still am drawn to constantly reading books on those kinds of subjects. And I have to comment that, I am an English major. And my life in the world of being an English major was I read tons of fictional stories, studied all these authors. And of course, I read some things that were nonfiction. But once I had this experience and I began this spiritual reading quest, I could never read another fiction book. I had absolutely no desire to ever read fiction. And I'm an English major. So I haven't read anything fictional in 35 years.
Oh my gosh. Can I just say that you are blowing my mind right now, because I used to read fiction all the time and I've never even put this together. But since then, yeah, I can't read fiction. Like, I am only interested in nonfiction about, spiritual things. And I mean, wow. So you're just blowing my mind right now. Because and people ask me, like, have you read that book? And I just have zero interest. I'm like, I don't want to read about things that are just made up when, I mean, it's so fascinating. And I have a limited amount of time, to engage with different, books and things. So I'm going to do it with things that fill me.
It's really great to hear you say that, because I've never actually spoken with anyone who made that same determination. And it's just weird.
It
It's just like
is.
it
And it's
just
not even, was it a conscious, right? It's, to me, it wasn't like, until you just said it, I didn't realize that all of a sudden I'm like, yep, I'm not going to read fiction anymore. It just was of no interest. I'm like, nope, not interested.
right. Exactly. And it blows my mind too. I mean, again, given that I'm an English major.
Right.
But so that was, one of the first things that happened. And but as far as, as I mentioned, in terms of after effects, my consciousness and my views of how life is and what we know about spirituality versus religion and all of that was, I mean, I was raised Baptist, okay? So, and Southern Baptist at that. And, I had always gone to Sunday school and I participated in church and everything, but I knew that so many things were different than what I had been taught, just innately, intuitively, as though I absorbed all these things. And then as I would think about them, I would realize, oh, it's not that way. It just kind of became part of me. So the change in consciousness was a big one. And realizing that we are, and not just us, but everything that exists in the universe, that everything is one, nothing is separate. We're all one with spirit, which is this energy of love. To me, I never can think of it in terms of masculine or feminine. In religion, it's so much more about he, this, and I can't think like that, because for me, and again, others experience different things differently. But for me, I refer to it as spirit. It is this great, all existing energy of love. And that is what we are. And we're so loved. And that is what, to me, spirit is all about. So that, again, to me was a big change in what I understood about the universe and who we are. But, talking about some of these other after effects, for example, and you may have some of these as well, but, I noticed that when I'd be driving along on the freeway, as I was driving, these lights along the freeway would go out. Or if I went walking down our neighborhood street in the evening, eventually one or two of the street lights would go out. And of course, then they would come back on after I was past. And I just kind of became accustomed to that, not really understanding at that point even that, that was an after effect. Also, immediately after having, this experience, I'll say, within a year or two, I could hear people's thoughts a lot of times as they would walk through the door. And I'm still able to do that to some degree. But I try not to infringe on people.
I was going to say, now that your friends hear you saying this, they're like, oh dear, I have to clear my mind when I walk through her door.
But it is still true that I can pick up on people's thoughts. So many times I know exactly what they're going to say before it comes out of their mouth, immediately the next sentence. But I also developed greater, deeper intuition in my own life and have been guided in so many ways, whether it's related to my career or my personal life, by this intuition and hearing guidance. As I've gotten older, I actually do get visions of upcoming things, and those can just happen anywhere. one day I was in my yoga class and just out of the blue, I started having this in color vision. And it doesn't last all that long, but I was completely surprised by that one. And as I said before too, even having guidance by hearing words, them saying, and I'm assuming it's my guides telling me the things that I should be aware of. Sometimes it's with both words and seeing visions. So that has also been part of that package. Right. And also ended up, I learned to read auras. That was actually offered through Unity Church. And to this day, I still take a look at people's auras, and you can see all different kinds of things. But and speaking of Unity Church, that was another after effect. I could not go back to Baptist church. Nothing against the Baptists. Unity teaches we're all on the pathway back to spirit, and I accept that. But I needed to be able to find some place that was more accepting and open of the idea of spirituality and the encompassing of all humanity.
Right.
And so 3 years after my experience, I did end up in Houston, going to the Unity Church there, and wherever I've lived, that's where I have attended. Again, just because it's more open and more focused on spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm curious, can you give us a story of your intuition, maybe something that helped you in your career, or any story that comes to mind that
Yes. One story, which I did include in my book, of such intuition was I had lived in a couple of other cities, Denver, Phoenix, Austin. Then I returned to Houston, and I had taken a job there in marketing, but after a while, not too long there, I was not very happy. And I decided, I need to start looking for another job. But I was unsure exactly what I wanted to do, because I've been in the world of engineering companies for many years. That was a lot of my background. But I had these words come into my head, and that was, send your resume to, and it was this man's name who was president at one of the companies I had previously worked for, but I had worked for them in the 80s. This was in the early 2000s. And I said to myself, why would I send my resume to him? I absolutely do not want to go back to work for another engineering company. I would like to do something a little different with my skill sets. And these, the voice and the information just continued to get after me. You need to send your resume to this man. So I just finally threw in the towel, and I thought, well, what can it hurt? The guy is well connected. He may know of something else. So I did that. And as it turned out, this president of the company, called me, because he's known me a long time. And he said, I belong to this particular association, and they are looking right now for a new executive director. And I was familiar with this organization because the company I was with, we had attended some meetings. And he said, I want you to submit your resume for this position, for executive director. And so I did that, and they selected me as one of their, list of final candidates. And I ended up getting that position. And I worked there for 14 years. I retired from there. And it was the very highest and best of my career. I loved what I did there. We made huge strides in a lot of issues. And I just loved it. And they were, the board was very pleased with my work. And, I worked with a lot of leaders in Houston and even in Montgomery County, Harris County. And I just thought to myself, what if I had just ignored, the guidance that my guides were giving me? I probably could not on my own have found that kind of opportunity. And, there've been other ways that I've been guided. And another one of those stories is when this was only a couple of months after my brother's death. And my husband and I had gone to stay Christmas at my dad's and his wife's house. And when we got there, my dad said, well, his wife, Frances, had been sick for the last day or two. And he said, I don't know if she's got the flu or what. And we said, well, we're sorry to hear about that. But we stayed with them anyway. And within a day or two, probably the second night we were there, both my husband and I became quite sick, very ill. And my dad was feeling very ill. My sister came by, and but she didn't stay. She went back to her house. And at any rate, that night, literally, my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. It was pumping so hard. And my husband tried to get out of bed, and he fell on the floor. He couldn't even get up. And I managed to crawl down the hallway. I mean, my dad and his wife were out in the other room. And I called my sister and I begged her to come back over to the house. And this was during a very extreme cold spell that was going on around Christmas time that year in Texas. It was like 20 degrees that night, which is, really bad for there. But when she got there, I told her, I was lying on the floor with the front door open, and I was staying by the front door. And I said, I can't get up. And I need you to go open the kitchen window. I said, there's something wrong in this house. And I just kept telling her, there's something wrong in this house. I'm 30 years old, all right? And that's where I stayed all night, was on the floor. My sister stayed on the couch in the living room where I had the door open and we had the kitchen window open. And the next morning, when my dad managed to get up, I begged him. I said, there's something very wrong in this house. I don't know what. And finally, he went to down the hallway. There was a closet there that housed their furnace. And he opened that up and looked in there, and the door to the furnace had come off, had fallen off. And essentially what was happening is we were dying of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't even know very much about carbon monoxide poisoning, okay? But that is what happened. And he fixed that, and it still took all of us at least another day or two to recover. But that, that's, my dad said, oh my God, we were having carbon monoxide poisoning in here. And it was horrible, how you feel, and you can hardly breathe. So we almost died, all of us. And I was guided to say this and tell him and beg my sister to come over, help me open up that window and keep the door open that night. So, that's not anything that I myself determined. These were just words that came through to me that I just kept repeating until finally something got done. But we did almost die.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it was really, it was frightening to go through an experience like that.
Oh my goodness. Well, listen, I would love to pull some cards for you if you're open for that. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah, I'd love to see what Spirit has to say about just your experience. And I love, just think that if you I don't know, hadn't had that awakening with your brother and all of that, I mean, you and your husband and your dad and his wife could have been killed. I mean,
Exactly.
it's amazing. Wow. Okay. All right. So the first card, which is the blockage card, is action. And what I'm getting about this is it's about really, it's almost like the using of the intuition. Like we want to use our brains, right? We want to be in action. And so the blockage card is it's like, it's not about being in action when you have this intuition. It's about, well, I guess it is in some ways. It's taking action by your intuition, but as opposed to initially the blockage is like us trying to think everything with our brain and trying to understand it, because our brains, this is so much bigger, right?
Yes.
Than our brains. We can't even comprehend what's happening. But so we're blocked in that we don't listen to our intuition. Instead, we try to use our brain to work. So the action card is actually miracles, because miracles happen when you actually listen to your intuition. I mean, your job, like there's no way, like you said, you would have found that job if you, one, hadn't have followed your intuition, or two, just tried to use your brain to find that. And then when you're fully attuned and using your intuition, this is the outcome card, is freedom. And I think especially your job, well, and the carbon monoxide story. I mean, if you hadn't followed it, I mean, you wouldn't have had that amazing job, and you could have actually lost your life had you not really listened to that intuition and just kept moving forward.
Exactly.
So, wow.
And I think in so many ways, so much about our life is trying to attain freedom in so many ways. It's, freedom can encompass so many aspects of who we are, what we do in life. Because freedom ultimately leads us to a place where we're extremely happy. We're motivated. Right. Mm-hmm. We're being true to ourselves. We're authentic. And, that's one of the things I discovered when I finally, after retiring, suddenly it was time to write this book and to share my story with the world. And it totally, once it got published and, seeing the reception that I got, even from multitudes of business people in Houston, it was like freedom for me, and it led me to authenticity, because I'd never been able to share that side of my life with most people. And it's just made a huge difference to be able to say, this is me totally. And that's freedom. But there's so many ways that word applies to people.
Right.
And to our lives.
I love that so much. And I love that, granted, it took you some time to be able to be comfortable to share your story, but now that you did, I mean, people are embracing it, and including business leaders. But I think, 30 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been the case, we've come so far in the last 30 years with
Yes.
spirituality and opening our minds and people awakening. And what I find with my Exploring Death podcast is I get so many emails from people saying, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one that this ever happened to, right? We feel so alone when we don't, because we don't talk about this as a society. We don't open ourselves up to be vulnerable and tell these very personal, poignant stories to one another, because again, we don't want to be viewed as crazy or
ostracized or
right. And which many of us have, in the past. I mean, just trying to be ourselves, in school and things, we're always shut down and just sit down and be quiet. That's kind of the societal mantra that we grow up hearing. So what a joy that you've written this and that people are being so receptive. So is there a moral to the story? Is there something like you'd like to share with the listeners that maybe they can take away from your experience, how they can embrace whatever's happening in their life?
Well, first of all, I encourage people in the terms of remembering oneness. that is such a key message that most people don't realize, and maybe don't even really understand. But everything, and I mean physics really backs this up too, but everything is one, and we're never alone in what we're doing or who we are. But also, I think accepting for people that our loved ones are still alive on the other side, and that there are many people and entities who are around us, our guides in addition to spirit, and our loved ones, when they pass, a lot of times, not always, but they do leave signs for us that they're around. But the key to that is that you must notice what is happening around you. And that's the key to figuring out that, oh, yeah, this is a sign, and just being cognitive of that. The other thing is, in my book, I talk about what I call meld into spirit technique, or MIST. And this is a way to connect with our deeper universal consciousness. And it's not described in the typical way that, people are advised to meditate on things. And meditation is great. But for me, I have found that it's really important to be able to walk around, and as I'm doing things, to meld with spirit consciously in those moments that we're around and doing whatever. And that's what I talk about in there, just being able for myself, because I've had that experience, to just imagine, the edges of my body just becoming particle-like and just merging, being part of everything, and letting that feeling become larger and larger until you're again part of the whole universe. And to be in that state, even if it's just for 5 minutes, when you're walking around in a park or riding your bike or being in the mountains or whatever, that I feel like it's just as important to be more consciously involved in that melding ability, and letting that be part of the consciousness, instead of always having to go sit aside and just be away from everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. That's necessary too. But I do feel very strongly about more of a conscious connection. In fact, I categorize that as what I call conscientious consciousness, whereby we, are aware of taking time to connect with that consciousness in a way that we're still out in the world. And in fact, I'm working on a workshop with some of those ideas. Haven't finished pulling together all the ideas, but I really feel that's important.
I love that, conscientious consciousness, because I agree. I love meditation, and I think it's a huge part of really having a balanced life, because you're able to, I always think of it as defragging my brain, like
Yes.
just go and be awake, but you're kind of getting rid of all those other things. But then to live your life consciously, conscientiously conscious. I love it, because it's almost like back to the day when, everybody would go about their life, and then, church on Sunday, and it was only that hour that people like, okay, I'm going to pray now and be religious. It's like, no, like meld that into your life, be conscious of being conscious, and not just in your moments of meditation or whatever. So that's beautiful. I love that, Paula.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I really believe that's an important aspect, and hopefully I get all the parts and pieces for the workshop pulled together to help people with that idea, especially in their business careers.
Right.
My career was very important to me, but it was important because I loved it. The last 14 years in the position I had, which was so perfect for me, I worked really hard, but and I state that in my book, but it didn't feel like work. It was like creating, as though I was just spinning all these things into creation, and it was just, I loved it. It brought
Yeah,
me such joy. And that's the way our careers, if you like having a career, should be.
I
Uh,
agree.
it
I
feeds
agree.
you creatively as a human with this energy to help people in whatever capacity, with your particular talents that you have. And it's easy to not accomplish or do that when you're in a position that you're not happy in and is not meant for you. And
Mm,
I've been there too. You have to reach the point where you understand. um, a really important phrase is know thyself, relating to what are your passions. Forget about the money aspect. That will
right,
come. The
right.
passion, the love generated from you for your work just expand exponentially with that.
Absolutely. I love it. I always like to say when you're working with spirit in business, it's your greatest competitive advantage because
Yes,
you have the entire universe at your fingertips when you're, tapping into spirit and allowing that to help guide you. And like you said, listening to that intuition, allowing yourself to fall into that position that you never would have found on your own, or going through a headhunter or whatever, right? So it's so
exactly.
important to be able to listen to your intuition and really connect with that.
And it
It's
can
truly
bring us such
yes,
joy. you know
right, which is what we're supposed to be here on the earth. I mean, even the Dalai Lama says we're here are to be happy. We're not supposed to be here suffering. So if you're suffering, it's time to take a look at what you're doing and evaluate and figure out what would make you happy. So I
and
love
we each have our different callings in terms of what our passions are.
right,
That's what makes the world go around, because um, not everyone is some artistic person who does whatever. You have to have the number crunchers, the chemist people, the engineers.
right.
But when they identify with that's what their passion is, then great things happen for people in their lives. So I'm
Absolutely,
a firm believer
absolutely.
in that. So
Fabulous. Well, gosh, I need to put an end to this. We could talk all day, Paula, but why don't, can you just tell the listeners the name of your book again and any websites or anything you'd like to direct them to, which of course I will have all those links on the website, but you can
yes, can you see my book here? I just show a
yes.
little. It's called Driving into Infinity: Living with My Brother's Spirit, and it's only found online. You can order it from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or Balboa Press. But it's available as an ebook as well as a hard copy and uh, paperback. And I know you're going to have the links to my email and my website. Um, the website address is a little bit long, but it's paulalenz.wixsite.com/Paula Lenz. Or you can put tinyurl.com/Paula Lenz. And the email it's essentially Paula Lenz, but the A in Paula is the number 3. So it's P3UL3 Lenz, LENZ @gmail.com. And, I welcome any and all questions or emails or whatever in relation to the book. And I've had many interesting discussions with people. And I find too, wherever I provide a talk, that there are always people who come up to me and share with me some sort of after death outreach they may have had from a loved one. And many times I'm aware of the fact that I'm probably the only person they've ever actually told that to. And
Right,
there is a real sense of joy that brings to me, that people then can feel free to share. So
right.
important.
So important. Absolutely. Well, this has been such a delight. Thank you, Paula, so much for your time. And I know this is going to benefit so many people. And I wouldn't be surprised if you get lots of emails.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It was just such a joy to talk with you about all of this and hear a little bit about some of your experiences or reflections on what happened to you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Death podcast. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Before you make any financial or legal decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Exploring Death. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.